Today on this episode of The Brain Surgeon's Take, we will be discussing near-death experiences, the science behind the phenomena, with Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry at UVA and best-selling author Dr. Bruce Greyson. Learn about these often life-transforming experiences from one of the world's leading experts and what they tell us about our physical and spiritual existence as human beings. Welcome back, everyone. Here's my take on Bruce Greyson. He is on the forefront of a unique and poorly understood phenomena. His experiences with patients has led him to become a leading expert on near-death experiences and their implications. As Professor Emeritus of Psychiatry at UVA, Dr. Greyson lectures all across the globe and is a best-selling author for the book After, which summarizes his views and perspectives on near-death experiences. This interview really made me think. As a neurosurgeon, I operate on the brain over 800 times per year, but never take into account the spiritual component of the mind. The brain is the most complex entity known to us, and we have so much more to learn about it. During the interview, I started to wonder, where is the soul? Does our being enter an afterlife when we die? Where does the brain end and the mind start? Bruce helps approach these difficult to answer questions with real science and moves us closer to understanding what the meaning of life is. Death is universal and something we will all experience at some point, but what should we expect? This was a really deep podcast. Listen up as we discuss near-death experiences, the science behind the phenomena. Check it out. Hey, Bruce, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Rick. How about you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited to talk to you about near-death experiences. I've been a fan of your work for a while, so look forward to hearing all your insights in it.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here with you.
Let me ask you a question, which I think comes to many people's minds, but how did you first get interested in near-death experiences?
It wasn't willingly, I'll tell you that. I grew up in a scientific household, and we never had any thought about anything spiritual or non-physical. So I went through college and medical school with that materialistic mindset. And my first week or two into my residency, I was confronted by a patient who was unconscious. And I couldn't talk with her. She was totally out cold. So I talked to her roommate who had brought her in a different room. And then came back and saw the patient. She was still unconscious. I had her admitted to the intensive care unit. And when I saw her the next morning, I went in to introduce myself. And she said, I know who you are. I remember you from last night. And that kind of blew me away. I didn't know what she was talking about. So she proceeded to tell me about the conversation I had with her roommate, and including intimate details. And I didn't know what to make of that. But, I was an intern. I wasn't there to deal with my problems, but hers. So I just pushed it out of my mind and said, I'll get to it later on. Though the next several years, I saw more and more patients coming forward with stories like that, and finally realized, as a scientist, I can't ignore these things. I need to look at them and see what's going on here. So I started collecting cases and studying them, and now, half a century later, I'm still trying to understand them.
Super interesting how you got involved and how much you've learned. For our understanding, how common are near-death experiences reported for those who nearly die?
For those who actually have a cardiac arrest, whose hearts stop, about 10 to 20% will describe a near-death experience. There may be more who have them, but just aren't willing to talk about them.
And does the acuity of the near-death experience affect the phenomena? So, for example, an acute car accident versus being under anesthesia and having a code blue during a surgery, does that affect the phenomena?
That's a difficult question to answer, Rick. If you look at patients whose hearts stop compared to patients who have a heart attack, but the hearts never actually stop, the rate is much higher among those who have a true cardiac arrest. And yet we see the same types of near-death experiences in people who don't have documented cardiac arrest. For example, falling from mountaintops or being in car accidents. As far as we know, there's no physiological proximity to death, and yet they have a full-blown near-death experience.
So it's really the cardiac arrest that's that unifying factor amongst all of these people.
Well, that's what we've been studying because those patients are easy to study. Um, but we haven't looked at people who have respiratory arrests or head traumas and so forth.
Now, of course, obviously those are much more difficult to look into.
Right.
Another very interesting question, right? Because people might think that this is spiritual. Does this vary according to religion, gender, race, age? Are you seeing any differences?
We're not, Rick. Certainly, religion or religiosity does not determine whether you're going to have a near death experience or what kind you're going to have. Um, Ethnicity, gender, age do not seem to make a difference either.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very interesting to see that whether you are religious or not, and to what extent that you're religious, doesn't make a difference. You would think that someone who lives their life incredibly devoted to God and religion, there's a higher chance of having these, but obviously you're saying it's not. So that kind of that's interesting to see that it's so uniform amongst those
Right, right,
populations.
right. I've known people who were atheists who never had any belief at all in a deity who had a full blown near death experience. I will say, though, that most near death experiencers say that there aren't any words to describe what happened to them. So when we push them to describe them, they end up using metaphors. And the metaphors they use may come from their religion. So, for example, many people will say, I encountered this warm, loving light. And if you happen to be a believer in God, you may say, this was God. Whereas if you're not, you wouldn't use that word. So your metaphors may be determined in part by your culture or your belief system.
So it affects your interpretation
Exactly.
of the near death experience. It does not affect the actual near death experience in itself.
That's right. That's right.
Now, so it does not vary according to religion, age, gender, ethnicity, and anything like that. But what are some unifying themes of these experiences that you have seen as you interview these patients? Do they all have a white light? You hear about the classic tunnel that people go down, outer
Right.
body,
Yeah.
childhood memories. What have you seen over and over again in these people?
Well, consistently, they have a strong sense of peace and well being. And this is in the context of coming close to death, which is usually painful and frightening. And all of a sudden, they're overwhelmed by this sense of everything is fine. They often feel like their thoughts are speeded up and much more clear than they ever had been before. Again, surprising with a brain that's under stress. Um, they often have a sense of leaving the physical body. Maybe a third of them will describe that. They may have a sense of reviewing their entire lives. Some people may go on to uh, encounter beings that aren't physically present that they may interpret as being deceased loved ones or deities, and they may come at some point to a point of no return, beyond which they can't keep going, and they'll decide to come back, or sometimes are sent back against their will.
Uh, it's so interesting because these are such abstract thoughts and abstract events on a very tangible event, someone dying.
Right.
In your opinion, what do these experiences represent? It's obviously it's impossible to know for sure, but in your opinion, what do these phenomena represent?
That's the $1 million question, Rick. I don't know the answer to that. I went into this as a materialist, convinced that I was going to find a simple physiological explanation for this. And every hypothesis we've been able to test, lack of oxygen, drugs given to patients, endogenous drugs produced by the brain, does not seem to be correlated with the near death experience. So we don't have a simple physiological explanation. That doesn't mean we'll never find one. We just haven't yet in the first 50 years of research. But science goes slowly. I don't know what they mean. I'm not a theologian, I'm not a philosopher. I can't really speak to non scientific explanations for this, but I wouldn't be surprised if we end up saying science just can't explain it.
Now, as a neurosurgeon, just prior to talking to you, but obviously having followed your work, I would have thought that it was pretty straightforward, right? You have anoxia, lack of blood flow to the brain, hallucinations. The brain is not functioning as well as it should because it's not getting the oxygen and the blood supply. So you start hallucinating. But interesting. So none of that correlates. So if you have a healthy patient and you try to replicate all of those physiological factors, none of them trigger a near death experience.
Not reliably, certainly. For example, if you look at um, oxygenation levels of patients who are coming close to death. Those who have near-death experiences tend to have higher blood oxygen levels than those who don't have NDEs. Now, of course, that just may mean those with better oxygen supply may be better at remembering what happened to them than those who didn't.
Yeah. Wow. It's what an interesting field and how difficult to interpret, because just like you said, you and I are both scientists. We rely on evidence, and now there's minimal evidence, and a lot of it is theory. And so it becomes much more abstract. And
That's right. That's right.
the other question is, how do these near-death experiences change life for the patients that you've seen, right? Do these events change their life for the better, for the worse? Are they traumatized?
They have very, very powerful effect on people's lives, and it's for some people it's for the better. For some people it's presents more challenges. They almost consistently say that they are no longer afraid of death after a near-death experience. No matter what they describe the experience as having been, they're no longer afraid of dying after this. And paradoxically, that makes them no longer afraid of living to the full extent. They're more likely to take risks, to live to the fullest. If something happens and they have an accident, what's the worst that can happen? They die, which is good for them. So they tend to be much more outgoing, much more impulsive, and enjoy life a lot more. They also tend to say that they are much more spiritual, and they don't mean religious by that. They tend to say that they feel equally at home in any house of worship of any denomination, or even just out in nature. But they feel the intense connection to other people, to the natural world, to the divine, which they didn't necessarily have before. Well, let me caution about that, because it's not easy to come back to a quote normal life after you've had this pronounced change in all your attitudes and beliefs and values. It can be very trying for the experiences families and their children and so forth. I've known people who had to. I'm sorry. I know people who've had to change their careers because of this. People who were in career military officers or career police officers who could not shoot after a near-death experience and had to change their careers. It certainly can, right? They also tend to become much less invested in material goods, power, prestige, fame, which may make them feel much more comfortable with their lives, but it doesn't make them get ahead in our Western culture.
Yeah, definitely does not get you ahead. So that's very interesting. What now? I guess the $1 million question is, how do you do research on these near-death experiences? Again, you and I are both doctors, scientists, and research is conducted in a very methodical fashion with hypotheses and data and then conclusions.
Right.
How do you advance our knowledge on near-death experiences? Obviously, it's a tough road.
Right. Unfortunately, we can't perform experiments where we give some people near-death experiences and others not. You just can't do that to people. So we're left with having to capture them after the event and retroactively try to reconstruct what they were like before this, what their personality was like, and what the physiological events of the near-death event were like, which is sometimes possible, sometimes not. It would be great to have brain imaging on all these people, but it almost never occurs. Um, so we're stuck with looking at people after the fact, which is not the best source of evidence. But we can look at what's going on, see what the medical records say about it, see what friends and family say about what they were like beforehand, how they've changed, and so forth. And there are some objective measures, like behavioral measures, of how they have lived their lives before and after. And we do find that people become much more altruistic after a near-death experience, much less competitive.
Now, you were talking about brain imaging. Obviously, very hard to get an MRI or a CAT scan. I mean, do you have
Right.
any brain imaging? Do you have any examples of what the MRI showed during these events, or a CAT scan, or EEG? I mean, potentially someone's having seizures and they have an EEG before they die. Have you had EEG recordings? This episode of the Brain Surgeon's Take is brought to you by Vitamin Water. Vitamin water is the ideal way to hydrate, replete your electrolytes, and maintain wellness. I drink vitamin water routinely during the day in order to keep up my energy and focus. Check out vitaminwater.com for more information and use the promo code BrainSurgeonsTake for 20% off your first order.
There have been occasional cases where someone just by coincidence had a cardiac arrest while they're having an EEG done. Um, and they don't show consistent things. Most of our data on EEGs during cardiac arrest show flatlining in a matter of 20, 30 seconds. And you see immediate changes within a few seconds, decrease. But there have been isolated reports of people who had continued identifiable brainwaves for 30 seconds or so after the heart stops. So it's hard to know what to make of these data. We do have occasional CAT scans of people who were in comas that show severely compromised brain structure that doesn't tell you about function. But we've seen brains that were virtually no corrugations on that side of the brain. It was so full of pus. We don't have MRIs. We don't have sophisticated data. People have tried to take near-death experiencers, put them in an MRI, and have them try to recreate the near-death experience. Now, that's not the same thing as having the experience. But what we find is when they do that, virtually the entire brain gets activated, which is not that surprising because it involves memories, it involves visual, auditory sensations, involves thought processes. So it wouldn't be surprising if you don't find one particular area that's associated with a near-death experience.
Yeah, I mean, if you could get a functional MRI or a PET scan during a near-death experience, that'd be amazing. But like you
Right,
said, there's more important things like trying to save the person's life.
right, exactly.
So, you are the author of the best-selling book After, and tell us a
Yes.
little bit about your impetus to write that book. At what point were you like, I got to put everything together so people understand what's going on?
Well, I've been thinking about that for decades, but it wasn't until I retired in 2014 before I started working on this in a serious fashion. Um, I tried to put the story out there um, through my eyes, how I came to approach this as a materialist and how my thinking changed over the decades as I learned more and more about these experiences, and try to bring the reader along with how my thought may have changed, and hopefully show them that what we thought we knew isn't necessarily something we need to hold on to as inviolate. That in science, all of our conclusions are tentative. We never have all the data.
Yeah. So there's obviously room to grow there, and I want to get into your perspective because it's tough to read a book and really get into someone's mind. But in your
Right.
opinion, what have your experiences and your vast amount of knowledge on this topic, what have they shown you about what happens when we all inevitably die?
Well, there's a lot of suggestions, not only from near-death experiences, but from other phenomena as well, that under extreme circumstances, the connection between brain and mind that we see in everyday life doesn't necessarily hold as fast as you're approaching death. There are times when the brain seems to be fading, when our thoughts and perceptions seem to be clearer and sharper than ever before. And that doesn't make sense in terms of what we know now about neurophysiology. But as you said, we don't know it all yet. Uh, but it looks as if, as the brain seems to be failing in its usual modes, consciousness seems to be expanding. I can't explain that, but we can observe it in things like near-death experiences, in terminal lucidity, in which people with end-stage Alzheimer's suddenly become lucid in the moments before death. We've done neuroimaging with people with psychedelic drugs who have elaborate mystical experiences. And we find that the more mystical experiences we see with those are associated with a decrease in brain activity and a connection between different parts of the brain. So again, there seems to be that under extreme circumstances, the connection between mind and brain that we see in everyday life seems to fall apart or at least become modulated.
I'm going to get into that in more detail, but I want to go back to something you said that I did not know about. So, there are examples of people that have end stage Alzheimer's who don't
Yes,
even know their own name, their family, their kids, their spouse, and at the very end become lucid.
that's right. That's right. It doesn't happen often. You don't hear about it often. But we did a literature search and found about 80 cases in the literature, mostly of France and Germany, medical literature, of the past 100 years. And in the last decade, there's been a lot of research into this phenomenon. The National Institute of Aging has two requests for proposals out to study this phenomena, and it's mostly being done in Alzheimer's research units. But we also see it with brain tumors, with abscesses, uh, with chronic schizophrenics, with a variety of cases in which the brain seems to be not functioning for a long period of time, and then shortly before death, they become completely lucid again, recognize people, start carrying on coherent conversations, and we don't really know how to explain this at this point.
Unbelievable. I'm going to go back to what you said, because I think that's the crux of the matter here. And that, it's the question of, where does the brain end and the mind and soul begin? And
Right.
obviously, as a neurosurgeon, I operate on the brain. I don't operate on the mind. But where is that interface, and what have we learned about it? Just summarize again, looking at your data, your experiences, where is that interface and how do we identify it? I mean, the two are one, right? It's coming from one organ, but where is the interface?
Well, we assume it's one organ. I mean, we're taught that the mind is what the brain does, that all our thoughts and feelings and perceptions are generated by the brain. And yet we have these examples of phenomena in which the brain seems to be shutting down, and these perceptions and feelings and thoughts still persist. So it may be that the brain is not necessarily the producer of the mind, but the transmitter or the interpreter of the mind. I mean, Hippocrates said this 2,000 years ago. Um, but we know that the brain does filter things, starting with our sense organs. The eyes filter out wavelengths that aren't relevant to our survival, and our ears filter out frequencies that aren't relevant to us. The brain evolved to help us survive in the physical world. So it shuts out things that aren't relevant to that survival. For example, we have a thalamocortical loop that regulates up and down different input. And right now we're talking. It's important for me to hear what you're saying. It's not important for me to see you. So the thalamocortical loop ramps up my auditory input and ramps down my visual input. And the brain is constantly adjusting the input according to what's most important for us right now. Also, the default mode network is important in filtering out stuff that's not immediately relevant to us right now. So we know that there are filters in the brain that let in or filter out various types of input. And that may be what's going on when you have near-death experiences or terminal lucidity, that under those extreme circumstances, the filtering process is altered in some way, letting new phenomena in, new experiences in, that normally are shut out. We don't usually walk around talking to deceased loved ones or deities, and yet in a near-death experience, when the filter is changed, we do have these experiences.
That's a very interesting way to look at it, that normal life, you have a filter, and then when you're having a near-death experience, basically the governor on the car engine is off and the filter is off, and it's a completely different sensory experience. That's a very interesting way to look at it. You
Right.
you ever think that maybe our brain is too simple to understand itself? Because the
Yeah,
brain is so complex, and I obviously deal with this all the time as a neurosurgeon, but our understanding of the brain is limited by our own brain.
right, right.
Is that
I
something
think
that you have seen or heard, or?
definitely, and I've heard that from many near-death experiences who say things like, when I was over there in that other world, everything made perfect sense to me. Now that I'm back in my brain, I can't understand it. An example of the sense of time. They almost always say there was no sense of time over there. And yet, when they tell us about the experience, they tell it as if it's a sequence of events. And how can you have a sequence without time? And they just sort of stare at me and say, well, it made sense over there, but it doesn't over here. So I think you're right that our brain puts limits on how we can understand things, which are very appropriate for what we need to survive in the physical world.
Yeah. I'm going to get personal and just ask you, do you believe in heaven, hell, or an afterlife? And if so, has that changed based off of your experiences with these patients?
Well, I came into this research with no concept at all of an afterlife, no religious background at all. But from talking to thousands of near death experiencers, what I come away with is a sense that our concepts of heaven and hell are based on our religious teachings. And people who have these near death experiences tell me it's much too simplistic. It's not that way at all. But they say there is something, and it's something that is almost universally described as being not to be afraid of. It's something that's blissful, something that you will enjoy being in. So I don't know what happens after death. I'm still not convinced that they're accurate in what they're perceiving. It may be there's nothing after death. When you die, you die. But it wouldn't surprise me if I wake up after death and find I'm somewhere else. It is. I have to say I'm agnostic about that. I really don't know. Most near-death experiences say there's no question in their minds, but I haven't had the experience. I don't know that for sure, and I don't have any religious teaching to support that for me. So I have to say I'm living fine without that belief in my life. It may be there. I don't know. I'm not, Rick, but I'm not sure I was before. When I was a young materialist, I thought when you die, that's the end of it. But there's nothing to be afraid of. If you're not alive anymore, there's nothing to be afraid of. Right. Well, as we said, you can't really do experiments inducing near-death experiences, but people are starting to get involved now in ways of mimicking the experience. For example, with psychedelic drugs, with guided meditation, with hypnosis. And they're not the experience, of course, but they're coming close to it and closer to it. And by looking at what's going on physiologically in the brain when you have these induced experiences, you may get models for how to explore the near death experience itself.
Well, I think we have a lot of work to do. I'm just not sure how we're going to do it. It's such an interesting topic. I think the crux of it is what you had mentioned, in the sense that I think that our understanding of these near death experiences are limited by our own brain. And I think that you're saying it best, that these patients who undergo these events always say that there's no time, there's a different sense of peace. So I feel like a lot of the questions of mind brain interface are too blurry and, quite frankly, too abstract for our own brain to understand.
That's right. That's right. I mean, one of the founders of artificial intelligence said that if our brain was simple enough to understand, we'd be too simple to understand it.
Exactly. Correct. And I think that what makes this topic so relevant and so interesting is that we're all going to go through this,
That's right.
right? Every single person goes through death. And what is that experience like? You've had a little bit of a taste of it, not yourself, but just talking to patients. And I think the fact that the vast majority of it say that it's peaceful, and it's not painful, and it's sounds like it's pleasant, I think makes the idea of death a lot more palatable for all of us.
Right. So maybe when you and I have this same conversation in about 50 years, we'll look back at this time and laugh at what we thought.
Yeah, and be like, what were we doing clowning in the real world? So I agree. Listen, Bruce, thank you so much for your time. Unbelievable interview. Keep doing the great work you're doing. If people have not read it yet, the book After, by Dr. Bruce Greyson, phenomenal, goes over all of his research and his experiences talking to patients with these near-death experiences. And again, Bruce, thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you, Rick. You too.